Actually, I'm not sorry.
Never again, never again will I be ashamed of something that is intrinsic to my humanhood. Hi, my name is Edwin Cameron, and this is For the Culture. Take one.
Cameron. Oh, yes, also we have you a wee gift, which is part of your prop.
I was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s and 70s. I think for every queer person, it was a matter of severe shame. The shame was so intense in apartheid South Africa that it was covert. There were bars, there were couples that you knew, women couples, men couples, there were transgender people, but very isolated. So for me, coming out in the early 80s was a joy. It was a liberation. It was enormously affirming, but also personally and politically dangerous.
We've had DJs. Yesterday we had somebody who worked for Kenya Airways as a pilot for 15 years.
I came out when I was involved with my first male partner after a disastrous marriage, to use the D word again. And then he accepted a job in Texas after 2 years of living together. Then for the first time in my life, I explored my sexuality as a gay man. I knew about AIDS. I knew about the risk of HIV, but of course, like all of us, I was exempt and I got infected. So for me, it wasn't a journey of adolescent realization, dating, and eventually falling in love and forming a lasting partnership. All of that was turned on its head. It was realization, horrified shame, and silence, and conformity culminating in marriage, and then AIDS set in.
Well, there's moving with intention and knowing yourself, because you can find beautiful intimacy.
I definitely agree. If you have the self-affirmation to see that, that it's not something that reflects disaffirmation.
Yeah.
There'd been an epidemic in Africa before, but it became known when queer men on the west and east coasts of America started falling ill from about 1980 onwards. And that was after the affirmation and joy of Stonewall, which was in 1969, and the absolute explosion of queer self-affirmation, queer political affirmation, queer joy pride marches. Suddenly, with a reactionary, bigoted president in America, Reagan, you had AIDS, afflicting hundreds of thousands of queer men. Men like myself, professional young people in their 30s who had cast aside the shame and fear of being queer. And that was my own personal journey too. So having come out, I get infected, I discover at the end of 1986 and go into a second closet, the closet of shame and fear, of stigma, of worse stigma than with being queer. And I eventually come out of it through my work. My work was with anti-apartheid organizations, with conscientious objectors who were white, refusing to serve in apartheid's army, and with unions, working with the National Union of Mine Workers, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and meeting people, miners, spouses and wives, who were so different from myself, who sat on the opposite side of my desk, me still keeping secret about my own HIV infection, and telling me a story that sounded unnervingly like mine. And that was revelatory for me. So I became involved in AIDS politics, and I became involved in AIDS organizations. I became involved in working AIDS Law Project, AIDS Consortium at the place at Wits Center for Applied Legal Studies where I was based, but not as someone living with HIV.
The address is, what? Guys, don't let me give him the wrong address.
Greensfield, yeah, you're right,
25 Greensfield.
I was in the High Court to start with, then in the Appeal Court, and then the Constitutional Court, which I was appointed a judge by President Mandela at the end of 1994. I'd studied law. I'd started law at Oxford and studied at UNISA. And my dream was to be a judge. And when I discovered that I was living with HIV in 1986, I knew I'd never become a judge. I knew I'd never see a free South Africa. I'd never see a democratic South Africa. I'd never see a South Africa under constitution. And then suddenly, then became a judge. And I'd spoken to the new Chief Justice, President of the Constitutional Court, Arthur Chaskelson, a wonderful man, a man of towering morals and intellect. Well, I confided in him. He said, "You aren't ill now. You may not fall ill." Of course, that was the hope of everyone living with HIV, that you would be part of that minuscule, less than 1% who might not fall ill. But 3 years later, I fell desperately ill. In September, October 1997, I was facing certain death. Within 30 months was the median survival time for someone in their early 40s, well-tended medically, well-nourished, with a home, people to take care of you. 30 to 36 months, I should have been dead. But instead, I started taking medications in November 1997, a year and a half after they became available. And why did I have them? Because I had the salary of a judge. And Belize is more east on the border of Nigeria.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then you're on the border of Ghana.
Exactly.
Okay, yes.
Let's do a virtual. So let's start at the side.
Simon Cordy, whose story lies at the center of the story of queer affirmation in South Africa. We cannot speak about queers in South Africa without speaking about Simon Seko and Cordy. The queer movement was white-dominated and male-dominated, and Simon changed all of that. He and Bev Ditsie and Phumzile Mthethwa, just saying their names is to me magic, because they changed a trajectory of history. And Simon made it possible for us, when the constitutional negotiations started, to argue to the constitutional negotiators that sexual orientation should be included.
Out of the closet, into the street. Out of the closet, into the street. Out of the closet, into the street. And harass those ones inside.
Simon was also ill, but his pathway of illness was different from mine. He had different access points from mine. It was believed in the late 1990s that AZT was going to be the drug to deal with AIDS. And Simon got AZT and started taking it. It works for 12 to 16 months, and then the virus finds its way around it. And eventually, when triple therapy became available to him, the triple therapy that I started in November 1997, Simon's body was resistant, and he died in December 1998. And that was at his funeral. Zaki Ahmed said, "It is shameful, it is a moral disgrace, it is unacceptable that these drugs that were developed with public money from the National Institutes of Virology, from the Centers for Disease Control, from university budgets, should be patented by these drug companies and sold at unimaginable profits." I was paying at that point 12,000 Rand a month, a third of my salary as a judge. So I joined Zaki and fought alongside the Treatment Action Campaign. They did 99% of the work. Zaki and his comrades in the TAC. But the worst nightmare wasn't the drug prices, because Zaki won that fight. For me, the worst of the stigma of AIDS was that the stigma came from, Black Africans, they have sex. Europeans don't have sex. Queer men, they have sex. Straight people don't have sex. And for me, that was the worst part of the stigma of HIV, that I was working for queer equality. By 1985, I'd given my first speeches. I'd met Simon. Simon was arrested in September 1984 in the mass uprising 60 kilometers from where we're sitting now in Sebokeng. Simon was one of the leaders, young man in his 20s, who led the uprising against the oppressive apartheid regime, the new system of governance that they tried to impose on the black townships. And Simon was at the forefront. He was accused number 13 in a famous trial in South Africa called the Delmas Treason Trial.
On the 16th of October 1985, the Delmas Treason Trial started in Delmas. 22 anti-apartheid activists were prosecuted under the apartheid regime's security laws and tried for treason.
I was charged on treason, I was charged on terrorism and subversion together with the 21 people. And it was also a way of fighting for my, for myself, because I was the only gay person within 21 people.
And I went to see him in prison, and he did an astonishing thing. He came out to his fellow trialists. They were kept together in the same cell. They were, of course, all toxic because they believed that black people should be equal and free in their own country, in a democracy, have dignity. So they were kept separate. And Simon came out to them, not only about being queer, but about having HIV, which I didn't do until 12 years later.
The torture's done. I'm done torturing you, I'm done.
Judge Edwin Cameron has helped develop South African law so as to truly reflect the fundamental values of the Constitution. His role in securing the inclusion of sexual orientation as a prohibited ground of discrimination in the Bill of Rights, as well as his advocacy for persons with HIV/AIDS, makes him a key player in South African and international law. Mr. Chancellor, I hereby request that you confer the degree Doctor of Laws honoris causa on Judge Edwin Cameron for his unstinting professional and personal advocacy for the recognition of every person's dignity, freedom, and equality, being the foundational values he has helped entrench in the South African legal system and beyond.
Hello, Edwin. Long pleasure to see you.
So,
I thought I turned it off. I'm sorry about that. Let me just speak to him front. Hi, dear. I'm in the middle of the filming, and I'll call you in about an hour when we finish. Thanks, dear. Thanks for the call. I'm looking forward to hearing, dear. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. I want to speak about Nhlanhla. So, at the age of 62, a Swati man writes to me, and he says he's in Johannesburg to do his PhD at Wits in aquatic science, but he needs help. And I find him help through another queer man called Christopher Seabrook, who's a generous queer man in a powerful industry position who has always backed the queer movement with resources. And Christopher sponsors Nhlanhla for 4 years. And then I get a message, I'm from Swaziland, and how's your weekend? I was so dumb that I had to come a few times before I realized what was happening. And gradually, after a time, and Nhlanhla and I started dating, and I was terrified. So I want to talk about intimacy. I think that intimacy is difficult for many people, straight and queer. But I think it's particularly difficult for queer people because we are taught to despise and reject and hate ourselves. But wow, did I want to run away. I spent 5 decades as a queer man running away. But the last thing I want to say is that I'm so grateful for Nhlanhla, and he's filled my life. It's not easy, it's not a dream, it's not singing in the sunset, into the sunset, but it's real, and it's something of substance and something of meaning for which I'm intensely grateful.
So my last question, just to wrap up. What is your hope for queer rights in South Africa and on the continent in general?
So what I would wish for is a world of joyous affirmation. And you see it in some families where gender exploration is affirmed. So I would wish for joy. I would wish for the integrity of self, the truthfulness of self. I am in the wrong body. I am queer. I am lesbian. I am intersex. I would wish that there can be joy, unconstrained pride and joy.
Actually, I'm not sorry.